Okay, Dr. Harwood has asked me to explain a little bit about this farm. Firstly, sort of got a number of different things. The land was relatively fairly infertile in most areas of it. I mean, real low phosphorus, real low potassium, not too low, but very low phosphorus throughout the whole farm. And what we do, it was all in fescue. It didn't have a single legume. You couldn't find a single legume on this farm, not one leaf. What we do is that we raise some cattle and we produce calves that we sell them as they grow. We grow them out from beginning to the end, and we buy some in the market and we grow them out. We have some chickens. We work heavy horses. The two that are out there, that's how this farm is farmed. And we have a few sheep. We had a lot more sheep this summer, but dogs got in and killed about 5 or 6 of them. And but basically it's an integrated thing like that. And we raise field corn, we raise oats, we raise some soybeans, we raise cowpeas, we raise grain feed to feed to the animals, we raise all the hay, we raise all the, mostly alfalfa, but alfalfa and mixed grass hay, and feed all of it to the animals. Nothing has ever been brought into this farm but lime, and it was all limed once, which is 5 years ago, 2 tons per acre, and the pH then was about 5.2 to 5.5 before liming. And we had 500 pounds of phosphorus, and we just spread it around. It never covered much. You know. I take it about 500 pounds, it was 5 tons. We had 5 tons of phosphorus, but it still didn't go very far. At the most, it was like 100, maybe 200 pounds per acre in some conditions, but that was rock phosphate.
How many acres is this?
This is 42 acres, but includes up in the top there. It goes over the top of the pines to the edge of the pines, and it's 33 acres of flat land here, of which we have subdivided it. And the front 6 acres that runs this way is going and in the process to being apple orchard primarily, produced for cider primarily. And then this middle section here is, you know, originally it was winter grazing, and this is a black dirt section that we don't use anything really but for making hay and then grazing in the fall. And if we, in the middle of the summer, we want higher feed value feed, we put them into that. And then there's a back 7 acres or 8 acres, and that's summer grazing. But what has happened now, just so we get the basis of it, over here is the field we have soybeans in. Maybe we'll get to that. What we're going to do is plant that to row crop vegetables. Over there, and it is just an acre there. There's another acre that had corn this previous year in it, and it's just overseeded with clover, red clover primarily, things like that. 6 different varieties of clover. And then we have planted this white lupine, which is, you know, a high protein feed. And then it went into clover over top of that. Then we have a section up there we put in the sweet clover, a section of cowpeas. Anyway, we'll go around. A lot of it is to go into row cropping for vegetables this year. And what other questions do you think I should answer?
When did you take over this area? When did it come into your...
We got it in 1980, the drought of 1980. And we really didn't start farming it until 1981.
Okay, so now you're looking to be primarily a livestock raising operation with apples and some vegetables and a few high value things that would be up here on this land.
Basically, that's right. But using throughout this whole thing, Dick, cowpeas and soybeans for southern legumes, we've got a combine, we combine them, you know. In other words, we're trying to integrate in basically field crops if it has weed control elements in it and things like that.
Okay. Okay, and so down here, these fields are well enough drained and dry enough that you can grow alfalfa and you can keep them and they don't flood or you don't get waterlogging and whatnot.
No, we don't. We can walk out there if you want.
Okay, well, yeah, we can a little bit. The pH is around 6, 5.8 or 6, I noticed.
Yeah.
Okay, and these are getting a bit low in phosphorus. Is that right?
When we came here, everything here was stupendously low. This had 11 pounds down here. This had, you know, like 23. Those out there had 17. And you went in the backfields, actually ones flooded by the creek, and we don't farm those in the backfield. I mean, we don't tillage them, except to keyline them. And those had maybe 73 pounds of phosphorus, but that's what it was.
Okay, but then the analysis that he showed me just a few minutes ago of the native phosphorus from soil that hadn't been farmed here was relatively high. So we're not dealing with a soil that's really inherently low in phosphorus. Apparently it's just been pulled down from the farming practice, pretty much in this bottomland. Up on that hillside, I'd guess it'd be different, but that isn't your land. But and the potassium is pretty decent here. Even out there, it isn't too awfully low. And it's good here, but not too awfully low there. So you don't have a real severe problem of either phosphorus or potassium, but it's getting low enough to where you need to do something about it out here.
Yeah, what I gave Dick Harwood this thing, where that greenhouse is virgin soil that has never been plowed, anything ever done to it. We bulldozed that and did it with a little out of fence line and between these two ditches. To refer what he's saying, this is virgin soil with 6.8 pH, never had lime on it, 74 pounds of phosphorus per acre, 396 pounds of potassium per acre, and 10,000 pounds of calcium went off the level per acre. And that's what the virgin soil was, picking up from where you said.
But see, even if you started at 300 or 400 pounds of potassium per acre and you farmed it to alfalfa continuously without putting anything back, you'd pull that right down you could pull it down in 4 or 5 years even if you had decent alfalfa crops with what you have out there right now. So what he's got to be careful about in this operation, what he's doing is he's pulling nutrients off of there, especially with the alfalfa. And you've got to figure out how to get them back then. And if he's grazing out there, so you're not removing too much with that. But one of the things you've got to look at is where is that alfalfa being fed, and to look at how to get that manure back, because that's one of the pieces. See, what you want to do is look at, okay, what's the flow looking like across the farm? And with livestock, he's going to be moving some nutrients around here, and he's going to be taking some off those fields. And so you've got to figure out how to capture it and get it back without losing it too much of it. So that's one of the things to look at, is the feeding operation and how you're going to tighten that down so that you can get those nutrients back to the field. You can cycle some of them into the high value crops and the vegetables, but you've got to get back onto those alfalfa fields too, because alfalfa will really mine it if you don't get some manure back.
What about
on
when
it.
you're grazing alfalfa?
Okay, then you're not losing as much, and theoretically, most of it's going back, so you're not as heavy on it. And where you're only haying it twice, you're not pulling as much off as if you were just if you were going much heavier. So it's modest pressure on it.
What about when you take a seed crop of alfalfa off instead of doing it?
Then you're taking very little off. Most of it comes off in the hay, the potassium.
If you don't have any animals, is there things you can grow that will supply phosphorus?
Okay, well then won't supply it, but some are more phosphorus mining than others, and some of the cover crops are. Again, like Austrian winter is one, but I don't know how well it grows here.
Yeah, it grows pretty good.
The pH here is such that see, the rock phosphate will do some good, and it should work fairly well. And depending on how much you have to pay for it and how you want to get it into the system, whether you just want to put it in the field or put it in the manure and then put it on. But in other ways of doing it, you can see people that will keep their livestock mostly in the field and have some kind of a portable shed. And if you want to reduce the need to collect and then get the manure back on and spread it, to keep the animals in the field and feed them in the field is one option. But see, they're going to have to do something. We can walk out and take a look at those. Did you say you dug some holes in them so we look at the profile?
Yeah, we only got down to here, but I can take a shovel and dig it.
Well, that's okay. We can walk over there. Okay, so what would you suggest for the strategies then? Looking at what he's trying to do for an operation, for looking at long-term fertility balance. So you get fairly flat soil, so with a little bit of care, he's going to be able to not have too much of an erosion problem as this field up above here. You see that's a different problem where there's a lot of stock in there and it's overgrazed and there's an erosion problem on it. Okay, well you didn't have that problem down here.
Yeah. Well, we tend to really control it. We graze all this at least twice a year, right up through here with electric fence, through the orchard and through every other section. But this year, I would like to point out, and here's sort of an analysis, that this spring, for instance, we've got an oats that we can plant in the spring, and we can grow that oats and cut hay on it. What we're going to do this year is even intensify more. In other words, the land that produces for livestock is even going to be intensified. More production for livestock, as well as the straight row crop vegetable, will be even more extensively, I should say, producing off of it. What we are trying to do, and you tell me what you think, Dick, is that, for instance, we just try to keep something growing all year round, absolutely. That being
Soil
essential.
covered.
Yeah, and as much legumes as possible. So what we will do is go in here and plant laying oats very shortly here, and then take a hay crop. Now say we're going to take that hay crop and we're actually going to feed it in the winter. What kind of percentage do you think we need to put back on there of the manure, for instance? Do you try to keep, I'm talking about livestock operation now, do you try to keep as much manure as you fed out on the place going back, or can you do it, spread it more evenly around, or can we go to fields that are less fertile and spread?
We're talking about using manure for vegetable production too, so we want
Yeah,
to...
so you're pulling some off for the vegetable.
Yeah.
And that isn't any great problem, especially on the nitrogen. Okay, what you'd want to look at I'd look at the nitrogen balance. And how heavy are you in legumes, in what portion of the land? And do you think you need more nitrogen? Like when you grow a corn crop on some of these fields, corn is just a good indicator of nitrogen. And how do you have enough on the whole farm? And there are ways of getting it in addition to alfalfa. But they tend to be a little bit more expensive. See, with alfalfa, you're getting it primarily as a byproduct, and you're inserting it into the system. And if you're a little bit careful with the manure, then in the droppings, you're not losing too much of it probably from the system. You can minimize those losses. But then there are ways of getting more nitrogen in, like with vetch and others. But those bridge crops or short-term crops that you're not harvesting for anything tend to get more expensive. And they're costing you money. You have to buy the seed. And vetch seed's been a little bit expensive lately.
Yeah, vetch $1.10 a pound here, but
Yeah.
we combine it too. One of our things,
Okay.
you see, that's why we got the combine, but basically is to integrate the operation, so we sell some seeds. Now, let me ask you this, on other seeds, take cowpeas, take vetch seed, you don't think that it really reduces nutrients in the soil that
No,
much?
it doesn't, and especially
Is that right?
and if you take like a clover crop, a real good practice, if you have intermediate red clover and your last crop instead of a hay crop, take off a seed, and then what you're doing is plowing back, significantly more nitrogen. After you've taken a seed crop of clover than if you've taken a hay crop, because the hay crop's removing that nitrogen. So oftentimes people will use that last crop as a seed crop, and then come out of the rotation there.
How important is your legume top growth if you're going to grow vegetables? To have, if you're going to say turn it over or whatever you're going to do to prepare the ground for vegetables.
Or
How
would it
much
be
does
this
that
way?
really contribute? In other words, can you graze that top growth before you put it into vegetables, or are you really detracting from organic matter?
I'd be tempted to graze it. It's worth more as feed than it is as
tempting to graze
fertilizer.
it.
Yeah, and you'd be really tempted to graze it first. At least I would,
Yeah.
because it's worth more as feed, and you're taking a bit more nutrients off. But for vegetables, you're probably going to have to use some manure or compost anyway back on them. And again, I'd concentrate it. Depending on how you're growing those vegetables, I don't like to just spread manure and spread it in and till it. You kind of like to localize it if you can.
You mean side
dress or something like that, depending on what you have to put it on with and how you're doing it and what kinds of vegetables.
Let's say you don't have manure. Can you keep your soil fertility up by doing just a rotation of vegetables with legumes with some kind of clover?
Yes, you can. You need to look at the cost though, and then what kind of equipment you have for planting and harvesting. And with a vegetable rotation, it's a quite different strategy then, and then do you have a readily available source of outside nutrients? And if you don't, and you want to make them, and you want to do it strictly for, to make it self-reliant in nutrients, again, it depends if you're starting. See, there's so many ifs in this. If you start with the soil that's very low,
You grow vegetables or flowers in the summer, and you plant clover in the winter, and plow it in the spring, and plant
and that's not enough.
flowers back.
If you're going to maintain any kind of a balance with vegetables, you almost have to have a 50-50. You're looking at something like a 50-50 mix. And what you do is you'd separate out your early season from your late season vegetables. Try to come out with early season things where you could get a good growth of a legume, a cover crop in after the early vegetable, and into the fall, so that you grow most of your nitrogen in your cover crop after the early vegetables, and then go into early vegetables again and then plant next year.
But
Or
if you don't have enough land for a really, like a 5-year rotation, if you want
so we're
just
still
like
talking
2
about a 1 year.
Right.
1 year. So to where you have less than a full year in the cover crop. And use something again like vetch or whatever you can get that would be rapid growing. See, clover takes quite a while to get started. It's better than alfalfa. You don't want to use alfalfa for short-term rotation. It's too expensive. The seed's too expensive and it's too slow at growing. So you need something a little bit larger seed, something that will take off faster and grow faster. The Europeans use a lot of mixes with mustard and all kinds of things like that, and they're much farther advanced than we are. The Europeans are, and in fact, if you look at some of the European organic literature for cover crops, you get a lot better idea than we have here.
But if you take off your crop like in July, a lot of the vegetables don't die off in a year, and you get something planted in September, you get a vegetable crop, and then the next year, should you still do a rotation, or should you put that back in the vegetables?
Also, you've done fairly
Or
well.
you like divide everything in half and just say, I just can't grow vegetables on half of it if I want to keep my fertility.
Well, again, you can go in with if you go in with fall, I don't know what late vegetables you have that would be for fall planting. But you could, if you had late vegetables, a fall crop, whether you get lettuce or whatever off as a fall crop, you'd have almost a full year of the legume, and you've still got a cash crop each year. What you'd like to do is get a cash crop each year. Yeah, and figure out what kind of legumes will either give you rapid growth in the fall or a rapid growth in the spring, whichever. But mainly what you're going to have to do is separate out your vegetables so that you don't have a mixture of 3 rows of say an early crop with 3 rows of beans, which are going to come off a lot later, or cucumbers or melons or something that are hot season. So just keep them separated out, and then look for cover crops that'll come in really quickly for you like that. And again, with vegetables, I would think you could. And depending on the soil and how you can till it, you're as much concerned with vegetables as weeds as you are fertility. Because you've got to somehow, on vegetables, typically what you end up doing is beating your head against the wall trying to weed and cultivate, and you get this weedy mess that comes in. And so, if you have some kind of power source to where you're going to have to till it after the vegetable, or disc it, or harrow it or something to get the cover crop established. So as long as you're not doing it by hand, if you're doing it by hand, then that's a real limitation. If you have a little bit of power, then you can go into the quick rotation. Or even animals, but some kind of machinery so that you're not doing it by hand. And then play with different cover crops. Well, if it's small, yeah. If you have, half or...
But it's like Eric said,
keeping something on it and keeping the weeds down and growing as much nitrogen as you can. And looking for something that grows fast for nitrogen and where the seed isn't so too expensive. And then don't necessarily grow a pure stand of a nitrogen crop. You can mix it with annuals like rye or annual rye or various kinds of mixes to give you better ground cover. And then try some things for early season like minimum till or zero till. Or even throw up some ridges in the summer or fall and get that cover crop and mulch on, and then plant early in the spring for your early spring crops, just zero till right through the mulch. And try to do some things like that so that you let the mulch and the cover crop work for you. You don't just necessarily plow it under. Yeah. So you really don't need to plow.
On the mixtures, we found, for instance, if we plant airleaf and sub-clover, any 2 clovers almost, although there's certain 2 very effective ones, we plant strips out there, we'll get 100% increase in both of them from 6 feet back where they both meet. They'll grow 100% bigger by just intermixing. They're solid stands, but there's some kind of nitrogen feedback between them. You can just see it. It'll just go up like this.
One of the things that you can do for, as an association of people is to accumulate information on these cover crops. Up in the Northeast, Will Brinton did this. He went into Europe and he learned an awful lot about cover crops. He has a really nice little manual out on European cover crops. Those are for the farther north. But you know, to get that European information or whatever you can gather from traditional sources here. And then maybe for the organic growers to circulate that and put it together so that we share that information. If you find a good cover crop that works really well on certain soil types, then to share it with each other. Because those cover crops are going to be crucial for all of this. You know, cover crops, short-term crops, the bridging crops, whatever you want to call them, integrate in.
If you wanted to use a field for a crop used for mulching and composting in a vegetable area, what kind of rotation do you have for that method?
For composting,
Right, like a hay field?
where you cut it off and then use it for mulch, where you don't have animals that you're feeding, but you do have a small hay field that you can use and you just cut it.
How does that deplete the hay field?
It would pull it down some, but you wouldn't be growing something like alfalfa, you know, probably some kind of a grass mix, I would guess, with the legume.
Well, some people here, Gordon is growing sorghum, for instance. He grows it for 2 years. You want to take it for the strawberry beds, right?
Okay, well, Sudax and sorghum does something else for you, that you have a really strong allelopathic effect from the hay. So, and it'll keep the weeds down in your vegetables. And in fact, the research at Michigan State is showing that what they're doing is growing this stuff in between the rows of young established peaches and apples and things. And then they go in and they just chop it and blow it in as mulch under the trees. It's a fairly strong allelopathic effect, especially from Sudac or sorghum Sudan. And especially in vegetables, if you're having a nut sedge or a sedge problem, that, you know, and you want a rotation crop to get rid of the sedge and to knock your weeds out. It doesn't do anything for the nitrogen, but plant a cover crop of Sudac and it really does a number on nut sedge.
When it's dry, how allelopathic is that? Very
It's
much.
supposed to have some, but it isn't as strong as sorghum, but it's been reported. But the allelopathy tends to be against certain kinds of weeds.
Is that right? It's specific.
Yeah, well, sorghum is fairly broad.
Well, we notice where we plant barley and we grow barley, you know, and we get the same thing. It seems to be much cleaner.
Okay, we didn't talk about allelopathic effect, but yeah, if you're going to use it for mulch, something like that, I'm assuming you probably want to have a perennial. You know, if you don't have tillage equipment and that sort of thing, you'd like to keep it for quite a while and decay it. You're going to pull the fertility down some. Again, you're not taking all that much tonnage out. You'd like to have some legume mixed in it so that you can move some nitrogen at the same time. I don't know, I'd have to think.
After a year or two, would you consider plowing it up and letting hay in the other spot? Moving back and forth?
Yeah, if you have, especially if you have an agronomic kind of field crop kind of thing, you could set it up for vegetables. Like if you just had your druthers and you didn't have to just keep vegetables in one particular spot. Like Eric says, you know, after barley does quite a number on the vegetables. You could figure out a rotation system here that would really knock the weeds down, leave you with a fair amount of nitrogen, and your vegetables would get more of a free ride. So, and you find, in fact, vegetable farmers doing that in Ohio. And you'll find field crop farmers who are growing commercial tomatoes, and they're shipping them from Ohio all the way into New Jersey to Kentucky. And you see these semi-trailer loads that look like rotten tomatoes that have been picked by machine going on many hundreds of miles, I guess probably 800 miles, just stacked in a semi like a load of sawdust or something, down to the ketchup plants. But you look at the fields that those guys are growing them in, and they come in between field crops in a rotation like that, and they're essentially getting a free or very low cost production.
After what?
Well, they'll come in after alfalfa or after a legume, alfalfa or clover, and then they'll come in with these tomatoes, and they have low fertility
So this is
requirements.
like substituting your corn.
No, come in as a corn substitute, but they're using tomatoes, and you're getting very low cost production and cheap enough that they can truck them all the way to New Jersey and make ketchup on them. But the biology is kind of interesting because the vegetables fit well with field crops.
What about barley?
It has an allelopathic effect against certain weeds. It will knock down particular weeds.
But not on vegetables.
Well, before vegetables.
No, he said
Oh, I
vegetables.
see.
You said vegetables by accident, Dick.
Oh, did I?
Yeah, but that's fine.
Oh,
He said
Have you
vegetables.
ever heard of anyone finding the turnip used as a cover crop?
In Europe, yeah, turnips are used, but they're used also as a grazing. People will plant turnips and then go in and graze them, and the cattle will just pull them out.
I've got one particular fellow who says he uses broadcast turnip seed in the fall, and then when he plows it in the spring, he finds much less in the way of weed problem.
Yeah, the Europeans are using several cold crops like that as rotation crops and as grazing crops. But turnips are a grazing crop, and they'll turn the cows in, and apparently there's a fair amount of carbohydrate in them and whatnot. They dig them out and eat them.
I did a test in Alaska on rutabagas. I got 26% protein out of the rutabaga bottom.
So, yeah, but you know, see what we're talking about immediately is we start talking about how to balance the nutrients here. We're looking at cover crops, rotation crops, for both nutrients and weeds. The two get almost considered together. You know, they go together.
So you got the nutrients and weeds.
You know, to manage them both together if you're going to do it with low inputs. And the filter the soil.
If you're real cold, you can step in here for a few minutes. I'll dig a hole in this virgin soil, and then we can go for a look at the other stuff. Just take a minute. Are you cold? If you aren't too cold, we'll go on. Want to go on? Sure. 300 pounds per acre. I went down 2 feet. Phosphorus hit 300 pounds. Went down 3 feet, and the potassium went off the scale. It's all in here, and we've been sort of thoroughly convinced since we did that. And you'll see when we do this soybean, I'll show you where we dug it here. So it's the same duplication. It's just leached. Is that correct?
How about if you dig down fairly deeply here?
You mean 5-6 feet?
Well, 3 or 4 feet. Did you try that out in here?
No, I never dug here, but it's more a rocky, not this black silt loam up there, but really never have dug here. But we have an example over here where we went down 3 feet. And I have the things right here.
You might want to try it out here too, because that's pretty interesting. If you increase phosphorus and potassium as you go down 2 or 3 feet, that means if you could put together a decent mining operation, you could begin to recover a lot of that.
Well, that's what our thought has been, to plant everything to alfalfa, see, and begin with that. The other thing, Dick, that's interesting about northwest Arkansas, starting Leslie and going over above Fayetteville, is a vein of phosphorus. It's 16 feet deep over in Leslie and 3 feet deep over above Fayetteville. And it goes all through this mountain. And they mined it. In Leslie, they mined it. And they shut the mine down just 10 years ago. So, but let me ask you this. If there was, in other words, if you look at this substrata and you find 24 feet down there is, in fact, a vein, how much movement is there even normally over time or anything, or you have no idea?
That'd be pretty deep if it was that deep.
Okay.
That stuff that's down 2, 3, 4 feet, though, would certainly be readily available, or you'd be able to bring it up.
What is your
Look
advice?
to see what the pH would be down there too. You know, check that pH. I'm assuming it'll probably stay pretty decent. It won't drop off to real low. I would guess in this soil. See, sometimes if the pH is very low as you go down, like on this red stuff, you know, and you go down below the plow layer, and it'll drop down into low 5s or high 4s, and then you have trouble getting alfalfa roots down into it.
Then what do you say?
Means you have more of a problem. We're here, you know, this is
reality.
there are things.
You bought the wrong piece of land. I told you that.
There are crops that will root down in there. Alfalfa may, or probably won't, not as well. You may have to get other kinds of cover crops that will go down into it.
How do you deal with the mice?
With what?
You mean the weevil?
The weevil.
And the aphids.
Well, what we've done about that, actually, Dick, we brought in from APHIS, Agricultural Plant Inspection Service, these weevil parasites. And this is the one place that has not been sprayed where they went and tested it. And after 3 years, we found it would only set down back your harvest about a week and a half. In other words, you do get weevils, but you see weevils go out of effect. They don't affect above about 74, 76 degree mean temperature. And they have no effect on your second, third, fourth crops of alfalfa.
You got any
So it's only the first
aphids?
crop.
So you cut it fast and let the sun.
Well, there's all kinds of things. You can cut it when it's young, you can graze it early, or you can just let it go. And we introduced these parasites, which Jaresko at Cornell, you know Jaresko up there? At Cornell in entomology, he introduced to New Jersey and New York. And in 2 years, they reduced the payment for alfalfa weevil herbicide $33 million in the Northeast, in those 2 states.
That's really an effective program up there. It's one of the real success stories.
You've had any problems with aphids?
I've never had an aphid.
just some neighbors of mine
No, I never had.
had a 12-acre field of alfalfa, and it was eaten up by aphids before he really noticed it. It was dead before he noticed it.
Aphids or weeds?
I think it's weeds.
Aphids? No, these were aphids, because my girlfriend has a 5-acre hay field, and about an acre of that, you know, she saw them and freaked out and sprayed them, and they killed that acre that they were on, but the rest of the hay field's still there. And it was the first time we'd ever seen, I mean, we have lots of
That
aphids
many
in the
aphids,
greenhouse and stuff, but this was just like zillions of them in a field.
Extremely dry season.
Wow, it was last spring.
Haven't seen it.
What variety of alfalfa do you use?
We tried a bunch of kinds. This was Weevil Check. This was planted 4 years ago. We're going to plow this year. Over here is Baker, and then there's oh god, I can't remember. Baker with something. I have a doctor at the university who perfected an alfalfa called Victoria. It's a spreading alfalfa. It's you know, it spreads out like strawberries underground. And we got 100 pounds this year. That's what I'm going to plant in this little stretch here.
Spread door.
Pardon?
Spread door.
Spread. Oh yeah. This is. That's why I was trying
Spreader
to.
2.
Well, we're talking about this is spreader 2 over here, but Victoria was perfected in 1971 by Orford at the university, and nobody plants it in Arkansas. And finally, this is the first year in 10 years that anybody produced it. Came out of Idaho, and they're selling it all over the north, Minnesota and Wisconsin and so forth. And you can graze it real heavy, and it's adapted to north of the Arkansas River. But there's absolutely nobody here that has planted it.
But Weevil Check, Baker, and Spreader 2 are the three.
Yeah, the 3 that we planted here.
Put a half acre of each in.
Do you feel you have an effective enough way of sharing information or getting information on these varieties that people are testing around? You know, is there any kind of mechanism for sharing this information? The state bulletin's good enough, or do you need something in addition?
The state building is completely outmoded, unfortunately. But I mean, even like Victoria, they've been saying plant Victoria for the last 6 years we've been here, but in fact there's no available supply. But what we've done, Dick, is through Ozark Organic Growers Association, we put out this newsletter.
Yeah.
And then we now have a grant from Rockefeller Foundation. And actually, the people that, under this grant, that's one of our purposes, wouldn't you say, Gordon, is to collect this, try to get it circulated and communicate it to everybody now.
Okay, because those kinds of operations, you know, work really nicely, and Noise Foundation is supporting other organic growing organizations in the Midwest. But you need to have input from very many different people, and maybe even get together on testing. Like if one particular type of alfalfa, if you're getting one from wherever, New Jersey or Cornell or wherever, that looks halfway decent, have a couple other people, 2 or 3 other people try it on different soil types and whatnot. And you know, you don't have to have fancy replication and all this business. Just put a strip of it out. But if 2 or 3 of you are doing it, you know, and then share the information, because you're not really in competition with each other and that kind of thing, you know.
This has been one direction. Gordon particularly suggested that the Growers Association would go, is actually to support people who wanted to do testing of different varieties of things, and then compile information about it.
We're trying to create some sort of liaison with the University of Arkansas so that we can have some input into their research projects and have some effect on what direction they take in there, and offer them assistance for whatever we can provide as far as field tests go.
But it's not only on varieties, but you know, a couple of you going out to California to the organic growers meeting out there, you get into a discussion with them on cover crops, and they're coming up with a whole range of things for Mediterranean climate that fits along the coast of California, and things that have just not been used before, some of the medics and whatnot, that really look promising. You see, there just hadn't been much research on that, and no systematic way of testing them here in the U.S.
Well, we've been working with Walter Graves, you know him, and he sent us 8 different kinds of button clovers, and we got about 12 different kinds of sub-clovers on this piece of land here. And as you say, we got from Canasana, we got bell beans. I really think this bell bean is a real possibility. You know, it's a fava bean, grows very fast. We planted in the fall here, and we've had down 10 degrees, and it hasn't killed it. It's sitting right in the garden. They're about this high, and of course they're just going to spring in the next 3 weeks. So again, what I'm going to do, actually, we're going to take this land right here, all this that wasn't grazed, plow this and plant this all to favas that we bring back next week from California.
Okay.
And this is an experimental plot to see how these bell beans grow.
Okay, and another source of information on cover crops, you know, people that are pretty good at this, the biodynamic farmers in Europe especially, and the biodynamic people in the U.S. like the outfit in Rhode Island, I guess it is, puts out some stuff on cover crops, and there's just a lot of information that circulates among biodynamic circles on cover crops. And you can or you don't have to use the inoculum and the other things that they do, but they really know how to grow cover crops for the most part. So a real good source of information.
What do you think of the inoculum of biodynamics? Have you tried some horns recently, Dick?
No, and I guess people ask about that a lot, and as a scientist, you just have to say you don't know. There's no way you can say it doesn't work, and you can't prove that it does. So there's no scientific work in other than the biodynamic circles that proves that it does. But as far as the connection with extraterrestrial sources of energy, you'd have to argue that there's a very proven connection in biorhythms in certain organisms that the medical research has shown with lunar cycles. Okay, well, how far that extends and how important it is, I don't know, but scientifically you can't say that it doesn't exist. But just how strong it is, and does it work in corn as well as it does in some kind of beetle, I don't really know, and you just have to say you don't know.
If you want a quick test on that, plant 10 radish seeds every day for a month. In 60 days you'll get a moonshine reading.
But the problem is, see, in researching that, it's connected with rainfall and temperature and insects, and there are so many other things that overlap. And we used to struggle with that at Rodale. How would we research it? And how do we separate out the lunar effect from other things that may even be associated with the phase of the moon, like the weather pattern is associated with the phase of the moon.
It says you're supposed to cultivate or plant or whatever, it's too wet outside, you can't get out there
Yeah,
to
so
do
it's,
it.
well, yeah, so how significant it is, I don't know, but so what you deal with are the things that, the major effects, like the fertility and the nutrient cycling and whatnot, and you just have to say we don't know about those. At least I don't know. Some people swear by them.
Can't hurt.
What is your opinion of the various preparations for inoculating the soil with rhizobia and rhodobacters, mycorrhizal?
And
Do you
also
feel
how
that those have
important,
validity in good, well-maintained soil?
and also the compost inoculation.
Okay, well, and there are several different sources of that, and those are pretty tough questions. Like, there hasn't been, you look at the research and it's kind of mixed. We looked at a lot of those different things at Rodale, and some of them are straight nutrient sources. And like if you get, the humates, for instance, are a nutrient source, and they do several different things chemically and biologically in the soil. Okay, it's a matter of how much money you want to spend and that sort of thing. My tendency is that the first line of structuring of the biological system comes with the crops. And you worry about those crops first in crop management. And then I guess I tend to be skeptical on most of those, and especially if you have to spend very much money for them. So, because there are just a lot of those products on the market. And some of them are nutrient sources, some are bacterial sources that inoculate, but inoculating soil is really tricky business because typically the inoculum you put in doesn't survive with the normal organisms that are in the soil. You may be able to do better at inoculating compost, but it's pretty hard to show with most inoculums in compost. If you do a decent job of making compost, it's better to do it well first. Keep it aerated, stir it or turn it, and have the right mix to start with. That's the most important thing. Then whether you get some additional benefit out of an inoculum, I don't know. The biodynamic people certainly think so. And you have to agree that, boy, they sure, some of them make some pretty good compost.
It's pretty well proven that rhizobium is effective as an inoculum for you.
On legumes.
But it doesn't hold true that mycorrhizae and azotobacters are equally as efficient in inoculating the soil directly.
But then usually not, but on legumes, yes, especially if you haven't grown legumes before. But at Rodale, when we went into the conversion field, we got a very definite response in soybeans to inoculum the first year, but we didn't any after that. Once we'd inoculated
Well, that's just to help them get going, right?
Yeah, for the first year, and then you had the inoculum in the soil.
Yeah.
And we did better, by the way, when we used granular inoculum that was mixed with the seed than we did with seed coating. We were using granules and putting them with the seed, and it was more effective than the coating. But we didn't get any effect to anything the second year.
Even if you change the variety of legume?
Well then, yeah, because see, you use Rhizobium japonicum for the soybeans, and it won't be effective on clover or something. But
If you had clover a few years before in that field, yeah.
then probably you wouldn't have to inoculate it. It wouldn't hurt to try it, I suppose, once in a while. And it's something that some of you, in the organic growers may want to try. Try inoculating and see if you do get a response from a good source of inoculum. And but I wouldn't spend a lot of money doing it on everything. And the way to do it is, don't do a whole field. Just do seed that you could plant across a strip so you can identify it, and then check it. And check for growth, and look at the nodulation to see if you get, visibly better inoculation.
One thing I've suspected, Dick, is that Rhizobium, like on all legumes, in other words, the inoculant you put on it, the only nodules you get are in the top 3 inches of the soil. What do you think? I mean, have you noticed them down? I don't notice them really down a foot or 8 inches on alfalfa. Is this normal, you feel?
Well, most of them are up near the top, but again, it depends on the soil. And yeah, you could find them deeper than that, but I don't know about maybe here. It depends how wet it is too.
You want to go over here?
Okay.
Or
Is there anything else you want to talk about on this?
Well, those are, they've all been grazed, but this is spreader alfalfa. I don't know what else.
It's a matter of an amendment. It's a matter of the source and what source you want to use. And for minor elements, you typically don't have to bring a lot in.
Yeah.
Like if, and there you normally, the soil test, the soil data that you get from the state will oftentimes indicate if there are major areas that are low in zinc or low in sulfur or something like that. Normally that's known. It's pretty rare that you get surprised on something like that. Like they'll indicate, the soil survey data will indicate that this whole group of soils or family of soils tends to be low in a particular element. And then what you do is just start looking for it, but if there's been no zinc deficiency around the area, for instance, then it would be unlikely that you'd run into an isolated field where you'd have a real problem. And again, if you're growing corn, well, there are crops where you can see the symptoms very nicely. And if you even have a hint of zinc or iron deficiency in the soil, you can pick it up in corn, especially early in the year when it's really growing fast and it gets up to be waist high and it's really taking off. And especially if you get some rain and warm weather and it really grows, you'll see the streaking down in the leaves. If you get even though you see some of that streaking, it won't necessarily reduce yield. It'll grow out of it later on, but it's an indication that it may be a little bit borderline. And sometimes when people dump too much phosphorus on, they can induce zinc deficiency. But normally you don't have too much of a problem. And I sure wouldn't go spending a lot of money just for prophylactic applications of minor elements. It's usually a waste of money.
How about things like dried seaweed or fish emulsion?
Okay, well, dried seaweed and fish emulsion, okay, those are, depends what you want to use them for. They're fairly expensive, so for using them on field crops, I'd be, a little apprehensive. They do have a lot of minor elements in them. Using them on vegetables is okay. I'd be, or not use them in a greenhouse, I guess, and I wouldn't put them in there because they have a lot of salt in them. Like fish emulsion has as much salt as it does sodium as it does nitrogen. And then there's some problem with some seaweed extracts. Depends on where you get it from, but a lot of that is a byproduct, and it's a lye sort of extraction process, and you'll see that it's extremely high in potassium, and there's far more potassium in it than would come from the seaweed in general. And Frank Eggert up in Maine, when he started looking into that, he's a soil scientist at the University of Maine, and he's a person who works with the Maine organic growers. He started looking into it, using a lye process here. The potassium was coming from lye. And if you talk about a chemical process, I guess it's almost like acidulation of phosphorus, a triple superphosphate. So as far as I'm concerned, there isn't much organic about that, but, and it's high priced. We used to use it a lot at Rodale, but then there was so much salt in it, we salted out our greenhouse right away, and then we quit. And so for the greenhouses,
Are you talking about like little seedlings, or are you talking about things that are permanently in a greenhouse?
well, we just salted the soil out so that nothing would grow it. So what we did for the greenhouse,
What about like flats that the soil's going to be in there for 2.5 months while your plants are in the
well, then it doesn't hurt you too much, but there's still nothing better, as far as I'm concerned, than chicken manure tea. We use
I tried manure tea last year, and it just burned the hell out of everything.
yeah, it's potent stuff, but this was used chicken manure. Did you leave the manure in the sack, or did you just mix it in the water?
I left it in them. sack.
Yeah, if you leave it in the sack, but the water is pretty potent, and you don't want to use too much of it. Just dilute it, because again, it'll burn. But it doesn't.
How much do you dilute it to? I mean, I've had it look in my tea when I was out here.
Well, we were diluting it 3 or 4 to 1, and then you don't apply it, don't water the plants with it. Just use it as a fertilizer source. But yeah, you do have to be careful because it's pretty potent stuff.
Let's walk over here. I know you're going to have to go, so let's walk over here to the...
But it doesn't have a lot of salt in it.
Oh, no. Lay out your contours. No, that's the whole deal. It looks flat, but it is. It drops quite a bit off after me. You got to lay down with the transit and stuff? Yeah, you got to be accurate. All I wanted to show here, Dick, to get your comments out. Firstly, this was just soybeans. You see what it did to the next wheat crop. Eliminated it, and then we overseeded it with crimson clover, and it was a little too late. Our real problem is water, for 2 reasons. Corn grows excellently, beautiful dark green, never turns yellow, but sunny years if you have drought, right? And then secondly, when we come in and we're trying to seed in these crops, we should be doing the first week of September. Instead, it's inevitably dry, and even if we seed it, it doesn't germinate until the end of September, and then they're too small for the frost. I've explained that. So, the reason I brought you over here is that you can't see very well. You can see better from the first back. This is the place. This was absolutely terrible when we came here and we did these 3 soil tests on this, we call it soybean field. One that went to 6 inches, I believe, and then one to 13 inches, and one to 12 inches, and one to 17 inches. And Dick, it says, like in the top now, there's 138 pounds of phosphorus, 6 point, 275 pounds of potassium. And then you go down 6 inches, below 7 inches is 5.7. Is that going to be decent if you try to grow alfalfa in here? You don't think it'll have any effect? That's what I was sort of asking.
It shouldn't be too bad at 5.7. It doesn't really drop off. If it drops off into the low 5s or high 4s, I guess that's a little worrying.
Okay, and then you go, this is where this first comes into play. See, as soon as you go down to 16 inches down, you get 345 pounds of potassium. And up at the top, you get 275. Well, it happens to be high. Now, this was terribly low. When we first came to this field, the phosphorus holding them in, so to speak, the phosphorus at the top was about 38 pounds of phosphorus per acre and about 130 pounds of potassium. So this is what really 4.5 years of just grazing, not even spreading manure, but just grazing and using legumes, plowing it and placing in legumes, and we only plowed it really 1 full time. So I was just offering it. I don't know, you can't even, when you see the different horizon colors of the soil, what is that actually an indication of? Less organic matter, the lighter colors, or what?
Partly, and then it's lighter and down. You get any kind of evidence of waterlogging, modeling or any kind of, you get waterlogging. That's
very waterlogged soil. It's terrible. They could never plant field corn here until the 1st of June. Because it's just
that'll
full of water.
just do a number on alfalfa rooting, depth of rooting. If it stays wet down there, you have a heck of a time bringing that stuff up because you can't get roots down into it. But it'd be interesting to dig and see how deep your alfalfa roots go. And does when you start drying out, like when you get a dry spell, does the alfalfa keep on going fairly well? And then why, if the corn just dries off, is it because it's shallow rooted, or is there anything, is it rooting down into this?
So you really
dry all the way down.
So could it be said that one thing really to do in dealing with crops, if you feel you have a problem, is really to dig up the root structure, right?
Well, that's one thing to take a look at it, and occasionally to go out and dig a hole and see what those roots are doing down there and how deep they're going. And then to look at the different crops and see if something is rooting deeper than others, if you have a restriction. The restriction could come from several different sources, and some it's pretty hard to do anything about. In this kind of soil, you don't have any kind of a plow pan. First, you haven't been plowing it that much, but it's unlikely that you do. Someone was mentioning from Missouri here that a mixture of buckwheat and soybeans and rape does extremely well there.
Sounds like
So
a
is there a
European
plant
variety.
that you recommend with deep roots that'll grow on our acid soil? with a fairly acid subsoil
Again,
that'll break it up.
some pasture grasses do pretty well and go down into that deep subsoil. I'm not sure about other crops for here. In the tropics, I'd know what to do. We'd plant castor bean and a few other things like that that'll root down into it. Cassava does, and some of the tropical crops, but I don't know for here.
And then one other question: when we were talking about the vegetables, you were saying, you know, to rotate them with the legumes like that. Can you use buckwheat in that respect, or
Sure.
is it not as good because it's not a legume?
Well, buckwheat is good, and it gives you weed control. Another thing you can use buckwheat for, and someone mentioned it just a little bit ago, it makes a nice nurse crop. It's kind of like oats, and it doesn't cover in the canopy too much. So buckwheat overseeded and then right into something else. And what you'd like to do is to figure out ways of getting from one crop to the other without having to tilling the soil. And those overseeded bridge kinds of crops, like if you could dream up some way of, say, using buckwheat with something else underneath it, and they both winter kill, and then you zero till plant your vegetables into it in the spring, or with just kind of minimal tillage in the spring, so you don't have to go in and plow it.
But I mean, I don't understand why people are so down on it. I mean, I can see some of the reasons, but when you look at this kind of ground like this, you look at the ground that's been dished up in the spring, you can see how it'll soak in the water better, and that it's got more air in it, you know, and that the roots have more room to grow. And
On heavy clay, possibly, then you get more benefit. But on soil like this, where it's fairly silty, not necessarily. You know, you don't necessarily gain anything from tilling it, and especially if you disc it. And like this is very silty, and it would tend not to stay cloddy. And what would happen if you know, on some soils you disc them, and what'll happen with the first quarter-inch of rain, it just seals the surface over, and then the water just runs off. So, you know, we get used to this clean business, of seeing nice, clean soil and whatnot, but that isn't necessarily the best. And like you look at Dick Thompson's fields, and they look trashy as can be. There's all kinds of trash and residue and weeds and stuff, and they're not just neat and clean like the Brubaker fields. And yet I think the Thompson fields are just a heck of a lot better. And because he's got all that trash and mulch and stuff there, and he's got the weeds under control. So, like again, it depends on your soil. If you have real heavy, sticky gumbo clay, then maybe you need to physically break it up to help open it. But you might want to just try fiddling with some things. Try, like this business of mulching a sod. When we found on a lawn, it was good loamy soil. It wasn't as silty as this, but it was a good loam with more coarse sand than this had. And what we did is just kill the sod. Like you take sod even denser than this, or try a hay sod, or even on your lawn, and just try mulching it. And you know, you try to dig it with a shovel, and it's just as hard as can be. And yet you take a pickaxe and chop a hole in there and put a tomato plant in, and mulch it to kill the sod, and you see what that tomato plant does. It'll amaze you. Because what happens, the roots just go right down in, apparently with the dying root channels of the grass. And so you might want to try that. You know, if you have a part of that heavy clay that's just sod, try mulching it. Okay, yeah, but the mulch is one thing, but then having to till is something else. So you can grow a mulch.
That's one of the reasons we do till, is because we can't get enough mulch. It's either weeds or till.
Well, but what Dick is saying is a little bit different too. Is that if you can get good growth, I mean, you got to get good stands. But if you get a previous good stand, good solid stand, you know, and then if you do something, you could till, you could put your rototiller right down the middle of it, just that wide, right? And you could go right in, or don't till at all, just some way that, say that whatever you grew there is oats, for instance, and the oats dies, you get spring oats, it dies in winter. Don't plant winter oats, but plant spring oats. And then come back and go into it. It creates a completely different structure of the soil.
Yeah, is there any way that you could get a, you know, like with oats, spring oats, a good heavy stand in the fall planting, so that you get it up so it's a good heavy solid stand, you know, plant it a little bit thick, so that then when it dies down, you've got actually a mat, you know, you get a good solid mat, and then try planting into it.
Just dig it, switch it back and forth.
One way strawberries are being grown now, they sow a heavy crop of spring oats in the fall into an existing strawberry field, grow up and winter kill back, and that will provide the mulch for the next year's crop.
Yeah.
Does this cover them up?
Yeah. grow up.
those hay.
It's just like going in there.
Because that was the deal with the sawdust. My dogs messed around my sawdust and just covered them.
Do you see any way that you could use the percentage mix of sawdust? I mean, you know, that's what we have. Is hardwood solid is primarily a percentage mix, some kind of composted
Or
manure.
even with chicken manure.
Yeah. Just like you could do it.
I don't know, I've never tried that, but it's an interesting thought, you know.
And
Why
maybe some
not?
lime.
What about the black
Counteract
sawdust
the
that's
acidity.
about 30 years old? There's lots of that.
Pardon?
The black sawdust.
Black sawdust.